obviously Toby mentioned, Andrew is in the chat. He has joined us, so we're great to have him. Just before we go to Andrew Mullen, I would like to talk to you about the IoT Security Foundation 10th anniversary conference, which will take place at London's IET on the Wednesday, the 23rd of October. We'll make the call for speakers presentation soon. Sponsorship and exhibitor opportunities are available now. My colleague Grant has put in the link there for you to email him about the PDF. It will be available on our social media and website very shortly, so have a look out for that. Without further ado, Andrew Mullen of Beko. He is a sustainability and regulatory affairs specialist, and today he's going to be presenting on the reality of UK PSTI. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First thing I wanted to check is you can hear me.
Yes.
It's been a bit of a nightmare. And the second thing I'm going to hope is I sent my presentation to Grant. I'm having laptop problems. As a company, we don't use Zoom. I've now discovered my laptop doesn't like Zoom. So I'm working from a tablet, but I can't actually do my presentation from the tablet. So I have emailed it to Grant. Grant, are you able to drive it for me?
Yeah, no problem. Just start.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. As you just heard, my name's Andrew Mullen. I work for Beko, where I look after regulatory affairs mainly. And PSTI has been a huge source of discussion amongst the industry, both in terms of major domestic appliances, which is the industry that I work in, but also in terms of consumer electronics. And I am part of no less than 3 industry groups looking at how we make PSTI work from a producer perspective and indeed a retailer perspective. So if we move on to the first slide, and I will drive through these quite quickly because I know we're a little bit behind. The first thing really to say, sorry, Grant, are you able to move on to the next slide? Thanks. So the first thing to say is that actually as manufacturers, reputable manufacturers don't have an issue with regulation. We actually like regulation, and if we move on again to the next slide, please, Grant, the reasons for that are very, very clear. An absence of regulation causes confusion. We aren't arrogant enough to think that we have the answers to everything. If a regulation is clear and a product it proposes a product is tested to a standard, then everybody understands what it is they have to do. And actually, we find, and we've had examples of this, where there's no presumption of conformity if there's no standard, and that just leads to individual opinion. And chaos reigns, and we've had examples of that over the last couple of years in a whole host of areas. So if we move on to the next slide, standards, as I said, they're an integral part of what we do. And actually, this is an excerpt taken from the General Product Safety Regulations 2005, which says that if a product meets a standard and in the absence of any other evidence, then you are entitled to assume that your product is safe and compliant. That makes life really, really easy for us. If we don't have standards, we don't have regulations that refer to standards, then what we end up doing is risk assessing. And as I said, everybody has a different opinion. So Grant, if we could move on, please. So I'm going to have a look at how we deal with regulation from a global perspective. I'll then have a look at how we deal with it from a more local perspective. And globally, if we could move on to the next slide, it really starts up at the board level. So Beko in the UK is owned by a company called 𝘗𝘛𝘚. 𝘗𝘛𝘚 in turn is part of the Koch group. They are both multinational conglomerates. Within our global board structure, we have central R&D, we have a sustainability and corporate affairs team, and they work alongside people like the factory R&D, the factory quality teams, the subsidiaries where I work, product management teams. And then rolling that out, we work with a whole load of other groups to try and make sure that the regulation we have and the standards we have fit for purpose and deliver benefits. So if we can move on to the next one, I've taken a couple of extracts from some global documents that actually get circulated around all our factories globally and all our key people within the factories globally. And it starts off with the importance to us of compliance with the regulations, because it provides us with easy market access. It gives us very clear criteria for how we design product and how we approve product. And not complying is, for a business like ours, a huge threat, not just financially, but in terms of loss of reputation. We work in an industry where there are 20 to 30 other players, depending on which particular category you look at, and customers are very savvy. And if there's bad news associated with your company, then these are customers who will go elsewhere. So a couple of more examples of what we do globally. If we could move on, Grant. So this is, I'm not expecting you to read this, but this is a spreadsheet that gets circulated amongst all the relevant people of standards, regulations, where we are, whether or not they've been implemented, whether or not there's something we've got to look at for the future. And if we move on to the next one, we've got how that then translates from a global perspective to an EU perspective. And then if we move on to the next one after that, how that moves on from an EU perspective to a UK perspective. And I think, one of the key points to make is that for us as an industry and for us as a manufacturer, but also for a number of our competitors, if we move on to the next slide, the key thing on the next slide actually is, so you're going to have to press the button again because it's clearly got some sort of animation in it. There we go. What's key for us is not just monitoring what's happening in terms of regulation, but getting involved. And so everybody within our business who has an expertise in a particular area is encouraged to get involved with standards bodies, regulatory bodies, industry bodies, to make sure that regulation and standards that are developed are fit for purpose. So that's how we look at it from a global perspective. If we can move on to the next slide, we'll start having a look at it from a UK perspective and the organisations that I get involved in, and they fall really into two groups. So if we can move on to the next slide, Grant. Looking at it from a government perspective, we engage with all the government. So very opportunely, I dropped out there. Hopefully you can hear I'm back. Yeah, so the organisations we deal with fall into two parts. So there's the government side, all the government departments you'd expect us to deal with. And really, I guess they fall into two categories. There's the sustainability side and there's the safety side. And most of the stuff that we deal with falls into one group or the other. The other kind of governmental groups that we deal with are all-party parliamentary groups and select committees. And I will talk about them again shortly. So if we move on to the next slide, the next slide really is the wider group of stakeholders that we engage with. I have to say, IoTSF is, from my perspective, a new addition, but from a company global perspective, we've been involved for some time. But there's a whole load of industry stakeholders there that we involve with. There's academics, there is government consultancies, legal firms. Big legal firms tend to get quite involved in regulatory development these days. And right in the bottom left, you'll see BSI, and actually I chair one of the BSI committees that looks at performance standards of appliances. So if we move on to the next slide, for us, good regulation comes from good standards, with appropriate requirements within the regulations and proportionate enforcement. And one of the things that we think is key when it comes to regulation is a level playing field that, it's great, government and enforcement authorities should enforce against manufacturers, but they should enforce against all manufacturers. The big manufacturers, often people will think they're easy targets to go for, but actually they tend to be the companies that play by the rules. And what we like to see is enforcement against everybody, big, small, and particularly wherever they're based in the world. So if we could move on to the next one. So what we like to see in terms of legislation, a benefit to the consumer. There's no point in having legislation that doesn't benefit the consumer. Timescales that are practical, considering the fact that most companies work on a global supply chain. Regulation that's clear and unambiguous is absolutely vital for us. A level playing field, proper enforcement, I've already talked about, and an opportunity to work with other stakeholders to develop standards and regulation that fit for purpose. Where it becomes, or where we struggle with regulation, is where there aren't clear benefits, where what's required isn't clear, we don't have time to implement things properly, where it's imposed rather than developed, and where we don't get help and advice from the government department responsible for it or the enforcement authorities to help us implement it properly. So if we move on, I will tell you how we think PSTI has fared in that. Actually, I mentioned this before, we like regulation, and actually all manufacturers see a benefit to PSTI. I haven't spoken to a single other producer who hasn't seen a benefit in what it's trying to achieve. We do have issues around what's required. We don't think it's entirely clear. We don't think the regulations are particularly well written. I've spoken to lots of people who believe that they understand how it should be implemented, and who are very clear on what some of the answers are to the questions we've got. But I've also spoken to people who will have a completely different view to that, and that's not a good position to be in. Regulation should be clear and everybody should understand it. Timescales I'll talk about in a minute. As producers, we don't really feel we were that closely involved in developing the regulations, and we don't really think that there was a partnership there. And we think that the advice and guidance that we've asked for from both DCIT and to a lesser extent OPSS really hasn't been to the level that we are used to getting from other departments, and that's causing us issues as well. So if we could move on. In terms of what's easy is the requirement. It's pretty easy to understand that we can't use default passwords. It's very easy to understand we have to have a vulnerability disclosure policy, and it's very easy, it's a qualified easy, that we have to state minimum support periods. When I say it's qualified easy, what we'd like really is for it to be a clear, as in it's got to be a date, it's got to be a number of years and months, something around that, just so we all understand it. At the moment, that is a little bit vague. So if we could move on. Where we do have issues, and this is my view, but I know it's a view shared by others in the industry. The regulations would really have benefited from some definitions. There's lots of stuff in there that isn't defined. There's lots of confusion about what's actually in or out of scope. I've had long discussions with John at IoTSF about Bluetooth products and whether or not they're in and out of scope. And I think we both agreed that actually the legislation is very, very vague on some of that. The statement of compliance is an interesting one. We've only just got clarification on who it's aimed at. There was a big debate around whether or not it was aimed at the consumer or whether or not it was aimed at the enforcement authorities. Nobody's entirely clear why it needs to be included, and we're even less clear about why it needs to be signed, because there's other legislation where we have to produce statements which are signed but which don't have to be included with the product, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And the time frame and making available has been hugely problematic for us. So if we could move on again. As an industry, we're very much used to working within the confines of a regulation that is placed on the market. This is widely accepted method used by government to define when legislation starts, and it covers a single product as opposed to a group of products, as it does with PSTI and making available. But it's the point at which it's first made available on the market. So the point at which is in the UK, we've got it available for sale, it's in our warehouse, that's placed on the market. And that's something that everybody can understand. And actually it makes enforcement very easy, because if it's not in the country, then it can be stopped at the border and everybody knows whether it's compliant or not compliant. If we move on to the next slide. This is an extract from a very recent document actually on packaging, but this is the sort of information we get from DEFRA when it comes to new regulation, where they set it out very, very clear. The implementation date is the 1st of April 2027, what it applies to, and the fact that if it's in our warehouse and it's available for sale, then it's not affected by the new regulation. It only applies to stuff that is coming in from overseas or is in the process of being manufactured. And so the next slide. Thank you. This is more around where it applies, and this is where it becomes problematic. And the reason it's problematic is because for PSTI, it applies to everybody in the supply chain. And it's very clear when we bring something into the market and we have it available in our warehouse, the supply chain for us selling the product to a retailer and that retailer selling it on to an end user or a distributor who then sells it on is very, very indeterminate. It can be a couple of weeks, it can be a few months, it can run into years. And I'll talk about a specific example of that in a minute. And we find ourselves in a situation now with PSTI where information that a retailer has products that a retailer has bought from us in good faith this month, last month, the month before, at the end of this month, they may not be able to sell because they'll no longer be compliant. They were compliant when they bought them. And there's been a lot of discussion around, well, where does responsibility for that sit? If the retailer wants to send them back to us because they can't sell them anymore, a manufacturer potentially makes the argument that, well, they were compliant when we sold them to you. It's not our fault you haven't got them through the supply chain. There is a much bigger issue, if we move on to the next slide, please, Grant, with house builders, because house builders work on incredibly long lead times. It's not uncommon for a house builder from finishing particularly apartment blocks take over a year to sell all those apartment blocks. So we could have potentially products that have been in place for several months, long before the PSTI regulations were even laid before Parliament, which are still not sold and will still not be sold at the end of this month, at which point they're no longer compliant. So they're still in the supply chain, they're installed in premises or in apartments, but they're not sold. And one of the discussions we've been having with OPSS is, well, what happens in those situations? Now, OPSS are, to be fair, taking a very pragmatic view, but I think the point is we shouldn't be in this situation. We shouldn't be 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out, and asking OPS what's going to happen in that sort of situation. Obviously, if the apartment block has got a whole heating, lighting, appliance system that's based on connected, then the lead times are going to be even longer, because then you're talking about stuff that has to go into a building infrastructure, and it could be 2-3 years in the making before those products are sold. So I think that's one of the big concerns we had around this regulation. So if we can move on again. I'm not sure how easy this will be to read, but this for me was a really critical point. In the government's impact assessment, they believed that this option might lead to retailers discarding somewhere between 5 and 45% of stock because it was non-compliant on the 29th of April. So this is stock that was perfectly compliant on the 28th of April and is no longer compliant on the 30th of April. Now, they describe that as a loss of revenue. It's not a loss of revenue, it's a cost. It's a cost for those retailers to buy those products, and it's a cost for those retailers to dispose of that product. And I find it incomprehensible that a government would feel that retailers potentially having to discard nearly half of their stock is an acceptable situation to be in. It's even more pertinent because last week I gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee on 𝘗𝘬, waste electricals, and they're looking into how we reduce the level of waste electricals we have. DEFRA has out a waste prevention plan that it's looking at. We're currently consulting on the waste electricals directive and a change to that. And the UK is the second largest producer of electrical waste in the world, with only Norway producing more per head of capita. I just find that any government or any government department that thinks that discarding nearly half of the products a retailer has is entirely unacceptable. So if we move on, and I will try and just rush through the last couple of slides. The statement of compliance confuses us in as much as it says it must be a physical document. We've asked OPSS about that. They've said that actually physical and document aren't defined within the regulation, or accompanied is not defined within the regulation. So you should probably assume that it has to be a physical document, but they're being quite vague about that. What they have said, if we move on to the next slide, please, Grant, is that it can't be a QR code. So in a modern world, which is going more and more digital, and legislation that relates to digital connectivity can't use a QR code and a digital certification. They actually said it would be for a court to determine that, and DC again have not been forthcoming with advice for us in terms of what might or might not be acceptable. Grant, if we could move on. This is our statement of compliance. It covers three very, very simple things. If we move on to the next slide, I've actually put an example of the declaration of conformity that we use for CE marking, which covers a whole load of things, a whole load of regulations. We don't have to put a signed copy of the CE declaration of conformity in with the product. And whilst it's quite easy to determine whether or not a product has a usable password, or whether or not we've provided an escalation process for vulnerability, and whether or not we've stated how long we will supply security updates for, it's very difficult to look at a product and determine whether or not it's got hexavalent chromium in it, which is what one of the things that the CE certificate covers. And so requiring a signed statement of compliance actually seems entirely disproportionate. And I think there's also concerns that what happens if other departments decide that's something that they want to do? Do we have to start to put multiple certificates in products, which consumers almost certainly won't read? If we just go on, I think a couple more slides. I think we question if this helps with consumer choice, particularly if the statement of compliance has to be included with the product. So a customer is faced with the going in Currys on their website, AO on their website, have over 300 washing machines, about 100 of which are Wi-Fi connected products. If they're in a store and they're looking, then they won't get to see the statement of compliance. So it's not going to help them with decision making. Our view is if there'd been a QR code, it probably would, because they could have a look whilst they were there. And if we can click on, I think that's probably the final slide. Thank you very much. Sorry for being late, and I think we've finished spot on time.
Thank you, Andrew Mullen of Beko. Thank you for joining us as well. It was great to hear that presentation on the reality of UK PSTI. Now, this chat video will be available on YouTube for members. Non-members will get a preview as well in terms of the talks. So that will be available on our LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Now, before we go into the Q&A section, there's a couple of things I wanted to address before that. Now, the IoT Security Foundation is currently in collaboration with several leading organizations to develop the 𝘗𝘗, and 𝘗𝘗 is Trusted AI Bill of Materials, just for those who don't know, a collaborative project aimed at creating processes and mechanisms to ensure the transparency and trustworthiness of AI systems as they become increasingly prevalent in our daily lives. Details are up on the news section of the IoTSF website. For those who's watching, there's a live link that my colleague has just put into the live chat for those who are interested. And before we jump into the Q&A section, sorry, just to mention another thing, is the IoTSF monthly webinar for May. And we'll have firmware vulnerability management. It's the talk on balancing open source versus proprietary code by 𝘗𝘗𝘧𝗜, who is the CEO and founder of the IoTSF member Bugproof, and he'll be joining us all the way from the lovely Budapest. We'll also have Johnny Tyers from FretPlane, who will be talking to us about the threat modeling in terms of the EU CRA legislation. So that's coming up in May, and I assure you Chris will be in that. We told him to take no more holidays. He's not allowed to, so he'll be presenting for that. So in terms of the Q&As, I don't think there's many, but I'll start with one for Toby, if that's all right, Toby. Which trends do you expect to see in relation to threats against IoT in the coming years?